Martin describes a bunch of different patterns of how to build business systems, essentially. And active record is a little bit of a footnote in there. The pattern is literally called active record. You can look it up in there. It's called active record. I wasn't even creative enough to come up with a name of my own, but it allows the creation, the marriage of database and object orientation in a way that a lot of programmers find a little off-putting. They don't actually want to pollute the beautiful object-oriented nature of that kind of programming with SQL. There was a rant by Uncle Bob the other day about how SQL is the worst thing ever. Blah, blah. Okay, fine, whatever. I don't care. This is practical. We are making CRUD applications. You're taking things out of an HTML form and you're sticking them into a damn database. It's not more complicated than that. The more abstractions you put in between those two ends of the spectrum, the more you're just fooling yourself. This is what we're doing. We're talking to SQL databases. By the way, quick aside, SQL was one of those things that have endured the onslaught of NoSQL databases, structured list data, for a better part of a decade and still reigns supreme. SQL was a good thing to invest your time in learning. Every programmer working with the web should know SQL to a fair degree. Even if they're working with an ORM, an object relational mapper, as active record, you still need to understand SQL. What active record does is not so much try to abstract the SQL away behind a different kind of paradigm. It's just making it less cumbersome to write, making it more amenable to build domain models on top of other domain models in a way so you don't have to write every damn SQL statement by hand.
We'll just say that active record is an ORM, which is a layer that makes it intuitive and human interpretable to communicate with a database.
Even simpler than that. It turns tables into classes and rows into objects. I actually think SQL is very easy to understand. Most of it. You can write some SQL golf too. That's very hard to understand. But SQL at its base, and much of the criticism against SQL, was it was written for human consumption. It's actually quite verbose, especially if you're doing things like inserts over and over again. It's quite verbose. Insert into table, parentheses, enumerate every column you want to insert, values, parentheses, every value that fits with that column. It gets tedious to write SQL by hand, but it's actually very humanly readable. Active record just takes that tediousness away. It makes it possible to combine things in a way that a humanly describable language just doesn't. It composes things into methods, and you can combine these methods and you can build structures around them. So I don't dislike SQL. I dislike a lot of things in programming. I try to get rid of them. SQL wasn't really one of them. It was just a sense of, I don't want to write the same thing over and over again. It was can we be a little more succinct? Can we match it just slightly better to the object orientation without trying to hide away the fact that we're persisting these objects into a database? That's where I think a lot of ORMs went wrong. They tried to live in the pure world of objects, never to consider that those objects had to be consistent into a SQL database. And then they came up with convoluted way of translating back and forth. Active record says, do you know what? Just accept it. This record, this object, is not going to get saved into some NoSQL database. It's not going to be saved. It's going to be saved into a SQL database. So it's just structured the whole thing around that. It's going to have attributes. Those attributes are going to respond to columns in the database. It's not more complicated than that. Stop making it so.
Yeah, but I should say, so I personally love SQL because I'm an algorithms person. And so I love optimization. I love to know how the databases actually work so I can match the SQL queries and the design of the tables such that there is, squeeze the optimal performance out of the table. Okay, based on the actual way that table is used. So, I mean, I think that pushes to the point that, like, there is value in learning and understanding SQL. I wonder, because I started looking at active record and it looks really awesome. Does that make you lazy? Not you, but a person that rolls in and starts using Rails, you can probably get away with never really learning SQL, right?
As long as you want to stay at the entry level of competence. And this is actually my overarching mission with Rails, is to lower the barrier of entry so far down that someone can start seeing stuff on the browser without basically understanding anything.
Yeah.
They can run Rails new blog, run a couple of generators. They have a whole system. They don't understand anything, but it's an invitation to learn more. Where I get fired up, and this ties back to the AI discussion, is when that's turned into this meme that programmers no longer have to be competent. They can just, the AI is going to figure it out. The generators is going to figure it out. I don't need to know SQL. Active record is going to abstract it away from me. No. Dude, hold up. The path here is competence. I'm trying to teach you things. I understand I can't teach you everything in 5 minutes. No one who's ever become good at anything worthwhile could be taught everything in 5 minutes. If you want to be a fully well-rounded web application developer, that takes years. But you can actually become somewhat productive in a few days. You can have fun in a few days for sure. You can have fun in a few minutes and a few hours. And over time, I can teach you a little more. Active Record says like, yeah, all right, start to here. And then like next week, we'll do a class on SQL.
And actually, you have this beautiful expression that I love, that a great programming language like Ruby has a soft ramp, the ramp goes to infinity.
That's exactly right.
So it's super accessible, super easy to get started.
And it never stops.
Yeah.
There's always more to learn. This is one of the reasons I'm still having fun programming, that I'm still learning new things. I can still incorporate new things. The web is deep enough as a domain. You're never going to learn all of it.
Provide sharp knives.
This is a good one, because another way of saying this, the opposite way of saying this, the Java way of saying is, do not provide foot guns, right? Yeah. I don't want to give you sharp knives. You're a child. You can't handle a sharp knife. Here's a dull butter knife. Cut your damn steak, right? That's a very frustrating experience. You want a sharp knife, even though you might be able to cut yourself. I trust humans in the same way that Mats trust humans. Maybe you cut off a finger. All right, you're not going to do that again. Thankfully, it was a virtual finger. It's going to grow back out. Your competence is going to grow. It's more fun to work with sharp tools.
And that actually contributes to the ramp that goes to infinity.
Yes, to the learning.
Value integrated systems.
We kind of hit on that one. Rails is trying to solve the whole problem of the web. Not just one little component. It's not leaving you a bunch of pieces you have to put together yourself.
Progress over stability.
You know what? If there's one that's dated, it's probably that one. At this stage, Rails has been incredibly stable over many, many generations. The last major release, Rails 8, was basically a no-op upgrade for anyone running Rails 7. Rails 7 was almost a no-op upgrade for anyone running Rails 6. I used to think it required more churn to get progress, to stay on the leading edge of new stuff. And I wrote this before I experienced the indignity of the 2010s in the JavaScript community, where it seemed like stability was not just unvalued, it was actually despised. That churn in and of itself was a value we should be pursuing. That if you were still working with the same framework 3 months later, you were an idiot. And I saw that and I actually recoiled. And if I was going to write the doctrine today, I'd write that differently. I wouldn't say progress over stability.
Well, maybe it'd be a function of the age of the programming language also.
Maybe, or a deeper understanding of the problem. I think part of what's so fascinating about technology is that we have this perception that everything constantly moves so fast. No, it doesn't. Everything moves at a glacial pace. There is occasionally a paradigm shift, like what's happening with AI right now, like what happened with the introduction of the iPhone in 2007, like what happened with the internet in 95. That's basically the total sum of my career. 3 things changed. Everything else in between was incremental, small improvements. You can recognize a Rails application written in 2003. I know, because the Basecamp I wrote back then is still operating, making millions of dollars in ARR, servicing customers on the initial version that was launched back then. And it looks like the Rails code, if I squint a little, that I would write today. So most things don't change, even in computing. And that's actually a good thing. We saw with the JavaScript ecosystem what happens when everyone gets just mad about constant churn. Things don't change that often.
By the way, on that small tangent, you just sort of visibly, verbally changed your mind with the you of 15 years ago.
Yes.
That's interesting. Have you noticed yourself changing your mind quite a bit over the years?
I would say, oh, yes. And then also, oh, no, in the sense that there are absolutely fundamental things, both about human nature, about institutions, about programming, about business, that I've changed my mind on. And then I've also had experiences that are almost even more interesting, where I thought I had changed my mind. And I tried it a new way, realized why I had the original opinion in the first place, and then gone back to it. So it happens both ways. An example of the later part, for example, was managers at 37 Signals. For the longest time, I would rail against engineering managers as an unnecessary burden on a small or even medium-sized company. And at one point, I actually started doubting myself a little bit. I started thinking, like, you know what? Maybe all programmers do need a one-on-one therapy session every week with their engineering manager to be a whole individual. So we tried that for a couple of years, where we hired some very good engineering managers who did engineering management the way you're supposed to do it, the way it's done all over the place. And after that, I thought, like, no, I was right. This was correct. We should not have had managers. Not every programmer needs a therapy session with an engineering manager every week. We don't need these endlessly scheduled huddles. We don't need all these meetings. We just need to leave people the hell alone to work on problems that they enjoy for long stretches of uninterrupted time. That is where happiness is found. That's where productivity is found. And if you can get away with it, you absolutely should. Engineering management is a necessary evil when that breaks down.
What's the case for managers then?
The case for managers is that if you do have a lot of people, there's a bunch of work that kind of just crops up. The one-on-one is one example that programmers need someone to check in with. There's another idealized version that someone needs to guide the career of juniors, for example, to give them redirecting feedback and all this other stuff. And it's not that in the abstract I don't agree with some of those things, but in practice, I've found that they often create more problems that they solve. And a good example here is, can you get feedback from someone who's not better at your job than you are? You can get some feedback. You can get feedback on how you show up at work. Are you being courteous to others? Are you being a good communicator? Okay, yes, but you can't get feedback on your work, and that's more important. It's more important that you work under and with someone who's better at your job than you are if you wish to progress in your career. And every single programmer I've ever worked with was far more interested in progressing in their career on that metric, getting better at their craft, than they were in picking up pointers that a middle manager could teach them. That's not saying that there isn't value in it. It's not saying there isn't value in being a better person or a better communicator. Of course, there is all those things. But if I have to choose one or the other, I value competence higher. Like that's, again, I caveat this a million times because I know what people sometimes hear. They hear the genius asshole is just fine and that's great and you should excuse all sorts of malicious behavior if someone's just really good at what they do. I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is that the history of competence is a history of learning from people who are better than you. And that relationship should take precedence over all else. And that relationship gets put aside a bit when engineering managers introduced. Now, the funny thing is, this conversation ties back to the earlier things we were talking about. Most engineering managers are actually former programmers. They at least know programming to some extent. But what I've seen time and again is that they lose their touch, their feel with it very, very quickly. And turn into pointy-haired bosses very, very quickly, who are really good at checking for updates, just seeing where we are on project A here, if you need anything, or are we ready to deliver to... Okay, yes, and also, no, just shut up. Leave me the hell alone. Let me program, and then I'll come up for air. I'll talk with other programmers who I can spar with, and we can learn something with, I can turn the problems over with, and we can move forward. If you look back on the history of computer industry, all the great innovation that's happened, it's all been done by tiny teams with no engineering managers, just full of highly skilled individuals. You've had John Carmack on here. I used to look up to id Software so much, not just because I loved Quake, not just because I loved what they were doing, but because he shared a bit about how the company worked. There were no managers, or maybe they had one business guy doing some business stuff, but that was just to get paid. Everything else was basically just designers and programmers, and there were about 8 of them, and they created goddamn Quake 2. So why do you need all these people again? Why do you need all these managers again? I think, again, at a certain scale, it does break down. It's hard to just have 100,000 programmers running around wild without any product mommies or daddies telling them what to do. I understand that. And then, even as I say that, I also don't understand it. No. Because if you look at something like Gmail, for example, that was like a side project done by Boucher at Google at the time. So much of the enduring long-term value of even all these huge companies were created by people who didn't have a goddamn manager. And that's not an accident. That's a direct cause and effect. So I've turned in some way even more militant over the years against this notion of management, at least for myself and knowing who I am and how I want to work. Because the other part of this is I don't want to be a manager. And maybe this is just me projecting the fact that I'm an introvert who don't like to talk to people in one-on-one calls every week. But it also encapsulates how I was able to progress my career. I did not really go to the next level with Ruby or otherwise until I had a door I could close and no one could bother me for 6 hours straight.
So in companies, probably one of the reasons is it's very easy to hire managers. And managers also delegate responsibility from you. So if you just have a bunch of programmers running around, you're kind of responsible. Like it's work. It's intellectual work to have to deal with the first principles of every problem that's going on.
Yep.
So managers, like, you can like relax. Oh, it'll be taken care of. But they then hire their own managers, and it just multiplies and multiplies and multiplies. I would love it if some of the great companies would have in the United States, if there was like an extra side branch that we could always run, maybe physicists can come up how to split the simulation to where just all the managers are removed. Also, just with it, just in that branch, just the PR and the comms people also, and even the lawyers, just the engineers, and let's just see, and then we merge it back.
I've essentially run that branch at 37 Signals for 20 years. And I've experimented with forking back on the other side. I've experimented with having a full-time lawyer on staff. I've experimented with having engineering managers. And I can tell you, life is much better at 50, 60 people when none of those individuals or none of those roles, it's never about the individuals, it's about the roles. None of those roles are in your organization full-time. Occasionally, you need a manager. Occasionally, you need a lawyer. I can play the role of manager occasionally. Fine. And then I can set it back down to 0. It's almost like a cloud service. I want a manager service I can call on for 7 hours this week, and then I want to take it down to 0 for the next 3 months.
Yeah, I read, I don't know if that's still the case, that Basecamp is an LLC and doesn't have a CFO, like a full-time accountant. Is that
so? What's actually funny is these days we do have a head of finance. We did not for the first 19 years of life, I think. We got away with basically just having an accountant do our books in the same way you'd do a small ice cream shop, except we would, over the times, have done hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. The scale seemed quirky. And at some point, you can also fall in love with your own quirkiness to a degree that isn't actually healthy. And I've certainly done that over time. And we should have had someone mount or count the beans a little more diligently, a little earlier. This was part of a blessing of just being wildly profitable and selling software that can have infinite margins, basically, that you kind of can get away with a bunch of stuff that you perhaps shouldn't. What partially taught me this lesson was when we realized we had not been collecting sales tax in different U.S. states where we had Nexus. And it took us about 2 years and $5 million in settlements and cleanups to get out of that mess. And after that, I went like, okay, fine, we can hire a finance person.
Okay.
And we now have a wonderful finance person, Ron, who actually ended up replacing something else we used to have. We used to have a full-time data analytics person who would do all sorts of insight mining for why are people signing up for this. And we ran that for 10 years and realized, you know what? If I can have either a data analytics person or an accountant, I'm picking the accountant.
I love this so much on so many levels. Can we just linger on that advice that you've given that small teams are better? I think that's really less is more. What did you say before? Worse is better. Okay, I'm sorry.
Worse is better on adoption for technology a lot of times.
Yeah.
And I think it actually comes out of the same thing. It comes out of the fact that many of the great breakthroughs are created by not even just tiny teams, but individuals writing something. And an individual writing something on some parameter, what they do is worse. Of course it's worse when one person has to make something that a huge company have hundreds, if not thousands of developers that they can have work on that problem. But in so many other parameters, that worseness is the value. That less is the value. In Getting Real, which we wrote back in 2006, we talk about this notion of less software. When we first got started with Basecamp back in 2004, people would ask us all the time, aren't you petrified of Microsoft? They have so many more resources. They have so many more programmers. What if they take a liking to your little niche here and they show up and they just throw 1,000 programmers at the problem? And my answer, perhaps partly because I was like 24, was first of all, no care in the world. But the real answer was they're not going to produce the same thing. You cannot produce the kind of software that Basecamp is with a team of 1,000 people. You will build the kind of software that 1,000 people build. And that's not the same thing at all. So much of the main breakthrough in both end user systems, but also in open source systems, in fundamental systems, they're done by individuals or very small teams. Even all these classical histories of Apple has always been like, well, there's a big organization, but then you had the team that was actually working on the breakthrough. It was 4 people. It was 8 people. It was never 200.
And the large team seems to slow things down.
Yes.
It's so fascinating. And part of it is the manager thing.
Because humans don't scale. Communication between humans certainly don't scale. You basically get the network cost effect. Every time you add a new node, it goes up exponentially. This is perhaps the key thing of why I get to be so fond of having no managers at Basecamp, because our default team size is 2. 1 programmer, 1 designer, 1 feature. When you're operating at that level of scale, you don't need sophistication. You don't need advanced methodologies. You don't need multiple layers of management because you can just do. The magic of small teams is that they just do. They don't have to argue because we don't have to set direction. We don't have to worry about the roadmap. We can just sit down and make something and then see if it's good. When you can get away with just making things, you don't have to plan. And if you can get out of planning, you can follow the truth that emerges from the code, from the product, from the thing you're working on in the moment. You know far more about what the great next step is when you're one step behind, rather than if you try 18 months in advance to map out all the steps. How do we get from here to very far away? You know what? That's difficult to imagine in advance because humans are very poor at that. Maybe AI one day will be much better than us, but humans can take one foot or put one foot in front of each other. That's not that hard. And that allows you to get away with all that sophistication. So the process just becomes much simpler. You need far fewer people. It compounds. You need much less process. You need to waste less time in meetings. You can just spend these long, glorious days and weeks of uninterrupted time solving real problems you care about and that are valuable. And you're going to find that that's what the market actually wants. No one is buying something because there's a huge company behind it most of the time. They're buying something because it's good. And the way you get something good is you don't sit around and have a meeting about it. You try stuff. You build stuff.
It really is kind of incredible what one person can do in 100 hours of deep work, of focused work, even less.
So I'll tell you this. I tracked exactly the number of hours I spent on the first version of Basecamp. And I was doing this because at the time I was working on a contract basis for Jason. He was paying me, I was going to say $15 an hour. That's what I got paid when we first got started. I think he had bumped my pay to a glorious 25. But I was billing him, and I know that the invoice for the first version of Basecamp was 400 hours. That's what it took for one sole individual in 2004 to create an entire system that has then gone on to gross hundreds of millions of dollars and continues to do extremely well. One person, just me, setting up everything. Part of that story is Ruby, part of that story is Rails, but a lot of it is also just me plus Jason plus Ryan plus Matt. That was the entire company at the time. And we could create something of sheer sustaining value with such a tiny team because we were a tiny team, not despite of. Small is not a stepping stone. This is the other thing that people get into their head. This is one of the big topics of rework, that it gave entrepreneurs the permission to embrace being a small team, not as a waypoint. Not as like, I'm trying to become 1,000 people. No, I actually like being a small team. Small teams are more fun. If you ask almost anyone, I'm sure Toby would say this too, even at his scale, the sheer enjoyment of building something is in the enjoyment of building it with a tiny team. Now, you can have impact at a different scale when you have a huge company. I fully recognize that, and I see the appeal of it. But in the actual building of things, it's always small teams, always.
How do you protect the small team? Basecamp has successfully stayed small. What's been the dragons you had to fight off? That, like, basically you make a lot of money. There's a temptation to grow. So how do you not grow?
Don't take venture capital.
Okay, that is step one.
Point number one.
First of all, everybody takes venture capital, so you already went.
I mean, that's been the answer for the longest time, because the problem isn't just venture capital, it's other people's money. Once you take other people's money, completely understandably, they want a return. And they would prefer to have the largest return possible, because not them sitting in the code, it's not them getting the daily satisfaction out of building something, chiseling beautiful code poems out of the editor, right? They don't get that satisfaction. They get the satisfaction maybe of seeing something nice put into the world. That's fair. But they certainly also get a satisfaction of a higher return. And there is this sense, certainly in venture capital, stated in venture capital, that the whole point of you taking the money is to get to $1 billion or more. Now, the path to that usually does go through running established playbooks. And then when it comes to software, the enterprise sales playbook is that playbook. If you're doing B2B software, SaaS, you will try to find product market fit. And the second you have it, you will abandon your small and medium-sized accounts to chase the big whales with a huge sales force. And by then you're 1,000 people and life sucks.
That said, I mean, people are just curious about this. I've gotten the chance to get to know Jeff Bezos. He invested in Basecamp, non-controlling.
He bought secondaries. So this was the funny thing, is that when investing have these two dual meanings. Normally when people think about investing, they think you're putting in growth capital because you want the business to hire more people, to do more R&D so they can grow bigger. Bezos didn't do that, actually. He bought a ownership stake directly from Jason and I, and 100% of the proceeds of that purchase went into my and Jason's bank account. Personal bank account. Not a single cent went into the account of the company because we didn't need the money to grow. What we needed, or what we certainly enjoyed, was to some extent maybe the vote of confidence, but more so the security of taking a little bit off the table so that we dared turn down the big bucks from venture capitals. It was essentially a vaccine against wanting to take a larger check from people who then wanted to take the company to something enormous that we didn't want to go with it. So Jeff gave Jason and I just enough money that we were comfortable turning all those people down in a way where if it had turned belly up, like 6 months later, we wouldn't have been kicking ourselves and going, we had something here that was worth millions, and now we have nothing, and I have to worry about rent and groceries again.
It is a vote of confidence. I wonder I'd love to hear Jeff's side of the story of like why, because he doesn't need like the money. So it's really, I think it probably is just believing in people and wanting to have cool stuff be created in the world and make money off of it, but not like
100% the motivation for Jeff wasn't a return, because he actually has a team, his private office, that runs these investments, who did the calculus on the investment pitch we gave him, which was so ridiculous that Jason and I were laughing our asses off when we were writing down our metrics. I was like, no one's going to pay this. No one is going to give us this multiple of this amount of revenue. And that's fine. I mean, we took the call essentially out of kind of an awe that Jeff Bezos even wanted to look at us. And like, do you know what? We don't want venture capital. We don't need other people's money. But like, let's just give him a bullshit number that no sane person would actually say yes to. And then, I mean, we can each go our own way. And his investment team said, like, Jeff, no way. This makes no economic sense at all. They're asking for way too much money with way too little revenue. And Jeff just went like, I don't care. I want to invest in these guys. Because to him at the time, it was chump change, right? Like Jason and I each got a few $1 million. I mean, whatever the currency swing between the yen and the dollar that day probably moved 10x that for his net worth than our investment did. Jeff seemed genuinely interested in being around interesting people, interesting companies, helping someone go to distance. And I actually look back on that relationship with some degree of regret, because I took that vote of confidence for granted in ways that I'm a little bit ashamed of. Over the years, I've been more critical about some of the things that Amazon had done that I feel now is sort of justified. So that's just sort of part of that processing of it. But on the economic sense, he gave us that confidence. He gave us the economic confidence, but then he also gave us the confidence of a CEO running, perhaps at the time, the most important internet business in the US, showing up to our calls, which we would have with him like once a year, and basically just going like, yeah, you guys are doing awesome stuff. You should just keep doing awesome stuff. I read your book. It's awesome. You launched this thing. It's awesome. You should just do more of that. I don't actually know how to run your business. You guys know.
So the book was out because I'm just from a fan perspective, I'm curious about how Jeff Bezos is able to see, because to me, you and Jason are like special humans in the space of tech. And the fact that Jeff was able to see that, right? How hard is it to see that?
He certainly saw it very early. And I think this is something that Jeff does better than almost anyone else. He spots that opportunity so far in advance of anyone else even opened their eyes to it, or certainly is willing to bet on it far earlier and far harder than anyone else is. And he's just right time and again. I mean, we were not the only investment that he made. And certainly Amazon had a extremely long-term vision. So far longer than I have ever had the gumption to keep. Like, I think of myself as a long-term thinker. I'm playing a child's game compared to the game that Jeff is playing. Like, when I looked at Amazon's economics around the dot-com boom and bust, they looked ridiculous. Like, they were losing so much money. They were so hated by the market. No one believed that it was going to turn into what it is, but Jeff did in a way that level of conviction I really aspire to. And I think that's one of the main things I've taken away from that relationship, is that you can just believe in yourself to that degree against those odds. That's ridiculous. He did that at so many times our level that it's pathetic if I'm doubting myself.
Yeah, I think Amazon is one of those companies. I mean, it's come under a bunch of criticism over the years. This is something about humans that I don't appreciate so much, that we take for granted the positive that a thing brings real quick. And then we just start criticizing the thing. It's with the Wi-Fi and the airplanes.
That's exactly it.
But I think Amazon, there could be a case made that Amazon is one of the greatest companies in the last 100 years.
Oh, for sure. I think it's an easy case to make. What I also think is that the price you pay to be one of the greatest companies in the last 100 years is a lot of detractors, a lot of pushback, a lot of criticism, that this is actually order restored in the universe. One of my favorite teachers in all the time I've been on the internet is Kathy Sierra. I don't know if you know her work, but she was active for only a few short years before the cruel internet ran her off. But she wrote a blog called Creating Passionate Users. And she carved into my brain this notion of balance in the universe. If you're creating something of value that a lot of people love, you must create an equal and opposite force of haters.